April 9, 1951. President Harry Truman sits alone in the White House, staring at intelligence reports that terrify him. MacArthur wants to bomb China. The Soviets have nuclear weapons. World War III could start within days if he makes the wrong decision. His approval ratings are collapsing. Congress is turning against him. Military advisors are divided. And the most popular general in America is publicly defying his orders, pushing for actions that could trigger global catastrophe. What Truman says to himself in these final hours before the decision reveals a president at his breaking point, carrying weight that no human should have to bear alone. This is not about the dismissal. This is about the loneliness of command, the terror of choosing between bad options, and the words spoken when a man realizes he might destroy his presidency to save the world. Subscribe to see the moments when leaders faced impossible choices alone. Harry Truman has never felt more alone than in early April 1951. The president who dropped the atomic bomb, who made the decision to defend South Korea, who has faced crisis after crisis with determination, now finds himself in a situation where every option seems catastrophic. He sits in the Oval Office late at night, reading reports about Chinese forces in Korea, Soviet nuclear capabilities, MacArthur's latest public statements contradicting administration policy. His wife Bess tells him he looks exhausted. His advisors see the strain on his face, but nobody can truly understand the burden he carries because nobody else has the authority to make the final decision that could mean peace or World War III. What Truman says to his closest confidants in these days reveals the depth of his isolation. He tells Dean Acheson, his Secretary of State, that he lies awake at night thinking about nuclear weapons being used again, not by America this time, but by the Soviet Union in response to MacArthur's proposed escalation in Korea. Truman understands nuclear weapons in ways that MacArthur does not, because Truman made the decision to use them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He knows the devastation they cause. He knows that once nuclear weapons are used in a conflict between major powers, escalation becomes almost impossible to control. MacArthur talks about using nuclear weapons on Chinese troop concentrations as if they are just bigger bombs. Truman knows they are weapons that can end civilization. The isolation is not just about the weight of the decision, it is about political reality that Truman faces alone. MacArthur is beloved by the American public. His approval ratings are far higher than Truman's. Members of Congress, even from Truman's own party, are calling the White House suggesting that maybe MacArthur is right, that maybe the general understands the Asian situation better than civilians in Washington. Republican opponents are preparing to use MacArthur's dismissal as political weapon to destroy Truman's presidency. Every political calculation says that firing MacArthur will be disaster. But every strategic calculation says that allowing MacArthur to continue will risk war with China and potentially with the Soviet Union. Truman talks to George Marshall, his Secretary of Defense and one of the most respected military leaders of the 20th century. Marshall understands Truman's isolation because Marshall has made difficult decisions that cost him politically. But even Marshall cannot make this decision for Truman. He can advise, he can support, but the constitutional responsibility belongs to the president alone. What Truman says to Marshall reveals his awareness that he is about to sacrifice his political future to do what he believes is necessary. He tells Marshall that he will probably not survive this politically, that firing MacArthur will likely mean the end of any hope for re-election in 1952. But he says that he would rather lose his presidency than risk global war because he was too afraid to confront a popular general who was leading the country toward catastrophe. The physical isolation matches the political isolation. Truman walks the White House halls late at night when he cannot sleep. Secret Service agents follow at distance, but they cannot ease the burden he carries. He sits in the Oval Office with lights off, staring out at the Washington Monument, thinking about the presidents who came before him and the decisions they made when circumstances forced terrible choices. What he says to himself in these moments, recorded in his personal diary and in accounts from staff who saw him during this period, shows a man who is terrified of making the wrong decision, but even more terrified of avoiding the decision out of fear of political consequences. The isolation of power means that courage is not about being unafraid, but about acting despite terror because nobody else can act in your place. The political situation Truman faces in early April 1951 is nightmare with no good escape. If he fires MacArthur, he faces immediate and intense political backlash. Republican opposition will portray the dismissal as weak president firing strong general who wanted to win the war. The public, which still largely supports MacArthur, will see Truman as political operator who put his own interests above military victory. Congress may even attempt impeachment, claiming that Truman is undermining national security by removing America's most successful commander during wartime. These are not paranoid fears. Republican leaders are openly saying these things, preparing their political strategy to exploit MacArthur's dismissal. But if Truman does not fire MacArthur, the alternative is worse in ways that have nothing to do with politics. MacArthur is publicly advocating for expanding the war to China, for bombing Chinese territory, for naval blockade of the Chinese coast, for potentially using nuclear weapons to offset Chinese numerical superiority. If the president allows his commanding general to continue advocating these policies publicly, America loses control of its own military strategy. Foreign allies, already nervous about American policy in Korea, will question whether civilian leadership actually controls American military power. Enemies will see divided command structure and exploit it. Most importantly, MacArthur's advocacy makes diplomatic resolution impossible because communist forces have no reason to negotiate when American military leadership is publicly demanding expanded war. What Truman says about this impossible situation reveals his understanding that he is trapped between political survival and strategic necessity. He tells his press secretary that he knows firing MacArthur will destroy his approval ratings and probably end his political career. But he says that sometimes being president means making decisions that cost you everything politically because the alternative is betraying your responsibility to the country and the world. The words are not heroic rhetoric for public consumption. They are private acknowledgement of reality that Truman faces alone in these final days before the decision. The pressure comes from every direction. Congressional leaders call the White House suggesting that compromise might be possible, that maybe MacArthur can be persuaded to moderate his public statements while remaining in command. Truman knows this is fantasy. MacArthur has shown repeatedly that he will not accept limitations on his authority or his public advocacy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff provide unanimous recommendation that MacArthur should be relieved, but they also make clear that this decision must be the president's alone. They will support it, but they cannot make it for him. Even this support comes with political cost, because their reasoning, that MacArthur's strategy would risk World War III, requires them to acknowledge publicly that America's most famous general is advocating dangerous policy. What makes the political trap so complete is that both decisions carry devastating costs. Firing MacArthur means political suicide. Not firing MacArthur means risking global war. Truman tells Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that he wishes there was third option, some way to resolve this without either political catastrophe or strategic disaster. But Bradley tells him honestly that no such option exists. MacArthur has made his position clear. He will not change. He will continue advocating for expanded war. The only question is whether Truman will stop him or allow him to continue. The political trap is complete because doing the right thing guarantees immediate political destruction, while avoiding the right thing risks consequences far worse than any political career. What terrifies Truman most in these final days before firing MacArthur is not the political consequences, but the strategic nightmare that MacArthur's policies could trigger. Intelligence reports on his desk detail Soviet nuclear capabilities. The Soviet Union now has atomic weapons. Not as many as America, and not as advanced, but enough to destroy cities if war comes. The Mutual Defense Treaty between China and the Soviet Union means that expanding the war to China risks bringing the Soviets into direct conflict with America. Once that happens, the logic of escalation could lead to nuclear exchange that destroys civilization. This is not theoretical possibility that Truman can dismiss. This is immediate threat that keeps him awake at night. Truman reads reports from his intelligence agencies about what war with China would actually require. MacArthur talks confidently about bombing Chinese bases and destroying their ability to supply forces in Korea. But the reports make clear that such operations would require massive commitment of American air power over Chinese territory, creating risk of Soviet intervention under their treaty obligations. If Soviet aircraft engage American bombers over China, what does America do? Pull back and accept defeat? Escalate to attacks on Soviet territory? Use nuclear weapons to prevent military defeat? Every scenario leads to worse scenarios, and Truman can see the chain of escalation leading to global catastrophe that MacArthur either doesn't see or doesn't care about because his focus is entirely on winning in Korea. What Truman says about his fear of World War III reveals thinking shaped by his experience with nuclear weapons. He tells advisors that he made the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, and while he believes that decision was necessary to end the war and save lives, he has lived with the knowledge of what those weapons do ever since. He has seen the photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He has read the casualty reports. He knows that nuclear weapons used against major cities kill hundreds of thousands of people instantly and create suffering beyond imagination. The idea that nuclear war might happen not because of deliberate decision to destroy enemy, but because of escalation spiral that nobody can control terrifies him more than any political consequence. The fear is made worse by uncertainty about Soviet intentions. Stalin is ruthless and unpredictable. Intelligence assessments cannot determine with confidence whether Stalin would actually honor the Mutual Defense Treaty with China if American forces expand the war to Chinese territory. Some analysts think Stalin would not risk direct confrontation with America. Others think Stalin might see opportunity to test American resolve and demonstrate Soviet commitment to defending communist allies. Truman knows that making decisions based on guesses about Stalin's thinking is gambling with the survival of civilization. MacArthur's confidence that the Soviets will not intervene is based on assumptions that might be completely wrong. If those assumptions are wrong, the consequences are nuclear war. What keeps Truman awake at night, what he talks about in private conversations with the few people he trusts completely, is the awareness that he alone has the authority to prevent this catastrophe, but that preventing it requires firing the most popular general in America and accepting political destruction. He tells Dean Acheson that sometimes he wishes someone else was president, someone who didn't have to make these decisions. But then he says that if someone else was president, someone who cared more about political survival than preventing World War III, MacArthur would not be stopped and the escalation would continue until war came. The fear of what might happen if he does nothing is worse than the fear of what will happen to him politically if he acts. In the final 48 hours before announcing MacArthur's dismissal, Truman's words reveal a man who has moved from agonizing over the decision to accepting its necessity with grim determination. On April 9th, after his final meeting with the Joint Chiefs and key civilian advisors who unanimously recommend relieving MacArthur, Truman tells them that he will make the announcement within days. His voice is steady, but his face shows the strain of weeks carrying this burden alone. What he says in this moment is not triumphant or confident. He says that he wishes circumstances were different, that he wishes MacArthur had accepted civilian authority, but that since MacArthur will not change, and since his policies risk global war, there is no alternative to dismissal, regardless of political cost. Later that evening, Truman sits in his private residence with his wife, Bess. She has watched the strain of this decision wear on him for weeks. What Truman says to her is recorded in his personal papers and in her diary. He tells her that he is about to make a decision that will likely end his political career and make him one of the most unpopular presidents in history. But he says that he took an oath to protect the country and the Constitution, and that oath requires him to maintain civilian control of military policy, even when the general being fired is beloved by the public. He says that future historians will have to judge whether he was right, but that he cannot make the decision based on what historians might think or what polls currently show. He must make it based on what he believes is necessary to prevent catastrophe. On April 10th, Truman calls in his press secretary and begins drafting the announcement of MacArthur's relief. The words he dictates are careful and measured, emphasizing that the decision is about maintaining constitutional principles of civilian control rather than about MacArthur's abilities as commander. But in conversations with staff during this process, Truman's private words are more emotional. He says that MacArthur is a brilliant general who has served his country with distinction for decades, but that brilliance does not override constitutional structure. He says that democracy cannot survive if military commanders can ignore civilian authority when they disagree with policy. The words reveal both respect for MacArthur's service and determination to defend principles that matter more than any individual. The night before the public announcement, Truman writes in his personal diary, "These words were not meant for public consumption and reveal his state of mind more honestly than any public statement could." He writes that he has made his decision and that he believes it is correct even though it will cost him politically. He writes that he hopes the American people will eventually understand why this was necessary, but that even if they never do, He must act according to his judgment of what protects the country from war with China and potentially with the Soviet Union. He writes that being president means sometimes making decisions that everyone tells you will destroy you politically, because the alternative is betraying your responsibility. These words show a man who is terrified of the consequences but more terrified of what might happen if he does nothing. What Truman says in these final hours before firing, MacArthur defines presidential courage not as absence of fear, but as action, despite fear. He is not confident that the public will support him. He is not certain that history will vindicate him. He is not even completely certain that his strategic assessment is correct and MacArthur's is wrong. But he is certain that maintaining civilian control of military policy is essential to democracy, and that MacArthur's public defiance cannot be tolerated regardless of political consequences. The words spoken before the decision reveal the loneliness of command and the weight of responsibility that only the person holding ultimate authority can truly feel. What Truman said before he fired MacArthur matters more than what he said when he announced the decision, because the private words reveal the human cost of leadership that public statements never show. The loneliness, the fear, the awareness that you are about to sacrifice everything you have worked for politically, because the alternative is risking catastrophe, you alone have authority to prevent. This is the reality of presidential power that most people never understand. Truman faced this burden alone because that is what presidential responsibility means. His advisors could counsel him, the Joint Chiefs could provide military assessment. But the decision was his alone, and so was the political destruction that followed. The immediate aftermath proved every political fear correct. MacArthur returned to America as hero. Millions attended parades in his honor. His speech to Congress was emotional triumph, where he defended his strategy and attacked the administration's policy. Truman's approval ratings collapsed to levels that made him among the most unpopular presidents in American history. Congressional hearings were brutal, with Republicans savaging administration witnesses and treating MacArthur as martyr destroyed by weak politicians. For months, it appeared that Truman's political career was over, and that his legacy would be defined by this single controversial decision to fire a beloved general during wartime. But the strategic assessment that drove Truman's decision proved correct over time. The Korean War did not expand to China beyond forces already committed. The Soviet Union did not intervene directly. World War III did not happen. The war ended in 1953 with armistice that preserved South Korean independence without the catastrophic escalation that MacArthur's strategy would have risked. These outcomes vindicated Truman's judgment that limited war for limited objectives served American interests better than expanded war that risked global catastrophe. The political costs Truman paid were real and immediate. The strategic benefits of his decision emerged more slowly, but ultimately proved he was right to accept political destruction to prevent strategic disaster. What makes Truman's words before firing MacArthur historically significant is what they reveal about presidential decision-making at its most difficult. Leadership often means choosing between bad options with incomplete information, while facing enormous pressure to avoid the necessary choice. Truman's private statements show he understood all the reasons not to fire MacArthur. The political costs were obvious and devastating. The strategic assessment could be wrong. The public would not understand. His presidency would likely not survive. But he also understood that some decisions cannot be made based on political survival, that constitutional principles sometimes require personal sacrifice, and that preventing World War III matters more than any political career. The legacy of what Truman said before firing MacArthur extends beyond the immediate crisis to broader questions about leadership and courage. Political courage is not about making popular decisions or about being certain you are right. It is about making decisions you believe are necessary, even when everyone tells you those decisions will destroy you. Truman demonstrated this courage by accepting political destruction to maintain civilian control of military policy and prevent strategic escalation that risked global war. His private words in the days before the decision show him as human being terrified of the consequences, but more committed to his constitutional responsibility than to his political survival. This is presidential leadership at its most essential and most costly. The willingness to sacrifice everything you have worked for, because the alternative is betraying the trust that has been placed in you. If you value these stories about the weight of leadership and the decisions made alone, subscribe for more moments when responsibility required sacrifice.